Hello, I'm Dr. David Scott from the Open University, and today I'm going to be talking about penology. Penology is the study of punishment and the institutions of punishment like prisons. Penology is therefore largely focused upon state punishments rather than simply punishment in society more generally, and specifically whether states have the right to punish. When we talk about the right to punish, what we are ultimately referring to are issues around legitimacy. The idea whether something is right, valid and appropriate. Philosophers and sociologists have highlighted 4 different ways of thinking about the justifications of punishment. So the first justification is the idea that punishment can be justified on the grounds of deterrence. Deterrence is basically the argument that an individual is deterred from breaking the law because they are psychologically changed in terms of their desire to offend. This idea of deterrence is based on the assumption that people are rational and that they calculate their future behaviours. There are 2 different forms of thinking about deterrence, both individual deterrence and general deterrence. Individual deterrence is very much focused on deterring the individual who has broken the law, whereas general deterrence is actually looking at a very different group of people in terms of who is to be deterred by the punishment. For general deterrence, the aim is not just to deter the person who's been imprisoned or punished, but rather to send a message to wider society to deter a broader social audience, notably the people who have not actually been punished themselves, but rather see the nature and extent of the punishment and through a calculus of fear are prevented in terms of their own desires of actually looking to break the law in the future. A second justification is incapacitation. Incapacitation relates to those notions of removing the physical capacity of somebody to break the law. Once again, there are 2 different dimensions to incapacitation: selective incapacitation and general incapacitation. Selective incapacitation refers to the harsher punishment of particular people who are considered to be of a higher risk in society. Therefore, those people who have a history of breaking the law in the past will receive harsher punishments and longer prison sentences because of their perceived higher risk of breaking the law in the future. There is also then general incapacitation, which is very much focused on the idea that we have the ability through various different forms of punishment, such as the death penalty and also the prison, to remove the physical capacity to offend in the wider community. The third groupings of justifications are those around reform and rehabilitation. Although reform and rehabilitation are often used synonymously, they actually are quite different things. Reform is based on the idea that a person who offends needs to change, that they need to be educated, and this could be through various different forms of education, but also things like developing a greater sense of commitment to work and also a change in their sense of morality. Rehabilitation is based on the assumption that the person who has broken the law has done so because in some way or other either shortly before the criminal activity or through the criminal activity itself, they themselves have actually been harmed. Therefore, because they have been rehabilitated through the occurrence of the criminal activity, what is required, just like in a kind of medical model or in terms of looking to deal with the causes and the cures for criminal activity, those who advocate rehabilitation are advocating treatment. They are calling for attempts to cure the offender and to make that person well again, just like you would do through a medical treatment. So therefore, when you talk about reform and rehabilitation, on the one hand, you have this argument that we should reform and therefore look to educate and to change the morals of a given individual, or that we need to rehabilitate, which means to restore the person back to who they were before they broke the law in the first instance, and therefore they need to be treated as one would treat a person who was ill. This then leads us to the fourth approach to justifying punishment, which is the approach grounded in the idea of retribution. Retribution and its associated concept of revenge are based on the premise that it is appropriate and right to punish somebody, to, in other words, harm them, to deliberately inflict pain against them, because they have harmed somebody else. There are a number of aspects to retribution which make it an attractive justification. First of all, it's linked to the notion of proportionality, that there can be somehow an association between the kind of wrongdoing and crime that somebody has done and the nature and extent of the punishment that they should receive. Therefore, proportionality and a proportionate response to a given crime is something which is very, very important to retribution. Secondly, it's also about sending a moral message indicating that a given behaviour is wrong and immoral. And this notion of denunciation is something which has been very, very important in terms of defences of punishment in the past and also in the present. This is because punishments are considered as means of sending a moral message to society about the moral boundaries that exist within a society and what should happen to individuals who breach those moral boundaries. What notions around the ideas of the right to punish, justifications, and indeed notions of legitimacy imply are ideas around the concept of power. And the idea that the power to punish ultimately is something which is fairly distributed across society. What penologists and those writing in this tradition of the sociology of punishment have pointed to is that the power to apply punishments is not fairly distributed across society, but rather is disproportionately directed against people from impoverished and poor social backgrounds. There is therefore an inherent bias within the way in which punishments, and notably state punishments like imprisonment, are applied in modern societies. One of the things that the sociology of punishment and penology have pointed to is that it's very, very important to understand all of these issues within their broader historical, social and economic context. And also that it's necessary to understand how and why we punish, and indeed why prisons continue to be so important in terms of modern societies, to locate this discussion within wider issues around social structures, around race, class and gender. Ultimately, and this has been noted by a number of penologists in the past, the extent and nature of punishment within a given society is reflective of the kind of civilization that that society is at that given time. Indeed, as we will see when we consider various different sociologists and philosophers, there is a continued emphasis that the more civilized a society is, the less the need to punish.